The Church of St. Myra's had been standing for nearly 200 years, nestled at the edge of a small New England town. Time had weathered its stone facade, but inside, it still felt strangely untouched, preserved in an atmosphere that seemed almost deliberately suspended. Most of the town's older residents treated St. Myra's with reverence, but also with a quiet unease. No one said why. Not directly. Michael was new to town, recently hired as a maintenance worker for the church. He wasn't particularly religious, but the job was stable and the hours were easy. The only rule the pastor emphasized was odd. Lock the sanctuary by 11:30 p.m. sharp. No exceptions. And never, ever stay past midnight. Michael chuckled at the warning. He'd heard old buildings had quirks, but this felt theatrical. What happens after midnight, he joked. The pastor just looked at him, expression blank, and said, just don't. That first week, nothing was unusual. Michael swept, polished the wood pews, cleaned the confessionals. He even found comfort in the silence, until he noticed the pipe organ. It was massive, looming in the back of the sanctuary, its pipes stretching up like metallic spires. And for some reason, it always felt slightly warm to the touch, even when the rest of the church was freezing. He chalked it up to bad insulation. But then came the first sound. It was faint at first. One note, low, like a breath through metal. He'd been locking up when it happened. 11:42 p.m. He paused, turned back, and stared at the organ. Nothing. Maybe the wind. The next night, it happened again. This time, 2 notes. A low chord. And this time, unmistakably deliberate. By the 4th night, Michael did something he'd told himself not to do. He stayed late. Midnight passed, and the church was dead silent, until the clock struck 12:01. The organ erupted, not chaotically. No, it was precise, controlled. A melody unlike anything he'd heard before, deep and slow, melancholic, yet alluring. It pulled at something in him, like it remembered him. Michael stood frozen as the notes filled the sanctuary. The pews groaned. The air thickened. He finally forced himself to move, ran to the organ, but no one was there. The keys moved on their own, each press slow, deliberate. He stared at the bench. Dust. No footprints. No weight. Then the music stopped. A whisper followed. Not from the organ. From the rafters. Play it back. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he confronted the pastor. The man didn't act surprised. He only asked one thing. Did it call you by name? Michael hadn't mentioned that. That hadn't happened. Yet, that evening, Michael returned against the pastor's wishes. Something had awakened in him, a compulsion. He told himself it was curiosity, but deep down, it felt like something older had reached for him, and something in him had reached back. He sat at the organ bench, unsure why. He'd never played before, but his hands moved instinctively, pressing chords he didn't know he knew. The sound was perfect, seamless, as if the organ itself guided him. Then came the voice, no longer a whisper, clear, direct. Play what we lost. The pipes trembled. Shadows stretched across the sanctuary walls, not cast by light, but seeming to crawl from the sound itself. The stained glass windows didn't reflect the room anymore. They showed a congregation, faceless, sitting silently in the pews. Each time he played, the images in the glass moved. A mass, a ritual, repeating, then stopping at the same moment, just before something horrible, something unseen. Cut off. He stopped playing. Silence. But the organ didn't stop. It continued, on its own, finishing the melody. And when it ended, every candle in the church lit at once, then extinguished. The next morning, Michael tried to quit. He packed, left town, didn't tell anyone. But no matter where he went, he'd hear it. The same melody, faint, distant. On the radio. In passing cars. Once from a child's toy. always at midnight, and every time he felt himself slipping, forgetting hours, finding himself humming that same tune without realizing. The song was nesting. The townsfolk began noticing things. The old pastor died in his sleep. A new one replaced him, but his sermons sounded eerily familiar, as though reading from memories not his own. Eventually, the organ began playing without any staff present. Visitors said it didn't just make music, it spoke. Not in words, in feelings, regret, hunger, worship. No one could prove anything, but some believe the organ was never built, it was bound. That St. Myra's had been erected over something not buried, but sealed, and the music was its voice. Now Michael is gone, his house abandoned, but inside, across the walls, someone has scrawled the same phrase in a dozen languages. At midnight, it remembers, and back at the church, the organ waits, not for prayers, but for someone to finish the song. There's something unexplainable about the acoustics of an old church, how even the faintest whisper seems to echo like a scream. St. Mercy's Chapel was one such place. Built in the late 1800s on a remote hillside, the church had been abandoned for decades until it was restored by a small local congregation in the early 2000s. But even after the fresh paint, new stained glass windows, and renovated altar, the air inside never seemed quite clean. The whispers started shortly after the baptism of a child named Elijah. His parents, new to the congregation, had insisted on using the original marble baptismal font, a relic preserved from the church's earliest days. It was ornate, white-veined stone with faded Latin engravings around its base. The priest, Father Colton, was reluctant, noting the church's records showed no baptisms had been performed with that font in over 50 years. But the family was insistent. They claimed it had been calling to them. The ceremony was quiet, traditional, and, at least on the surface, uneventful. But days later, Father Colton began hearing soft murmurs during evening prayers. He believed it was just the wind filtering through the eaves. That is, until the voices began forming words. At first, they were unintelligible, a mix of ancient Latin, whispers of names he didn't recognize. But soon they grew clearer. Please, cries for help, and sometimes laughter, childlike but hollow. Father Colton began documenting them in his journal. The voices return every dusk, he wrote. They grow louder when I pass the font. They stop if I touch it. By the third week, the whispers had spread. Members of the congregation began to report strange sensations when passing the font. An icy grip on their ankles, the feeling of breath on their necks, even a low vibration in the stone as if something were moving beneath it. One elderly member, Sister Agnes, confessed that the font had always been avoided in the old days. They used to call it the cradle of the forsaken, she said. Not a name you'd hear from a pulpit, but one passed through whispers. That font didn't baptize, it bound. Records were sparse, but Sister Agnes remembered a story from her childhood, of a child who was never named, baptized alone during a thunderstorm, who vanished before the next Sunday in Massachusetts. The priest at the time said the child had been taken by relatives, but Sister Agnes had overheard things. Things about scratching beneath the font, things about priests who disappeared. After that, the font was sealed and no one spoke of it again. Father Colton's final sermon was never delivered. He vanished the night he tried to remove the font from the chapel. His journal was found open on the pulpit, the last entry reading. It knows I'm trying to cast it out. Tonight, I break the seal. Pray for me. The next morning, the font was full, brimming not with water, but with something thick and black like oil. No one could identify it, and no one wanted to. The church closed once more, indefinitely this time. Years later, urban explorers documented their visit to the site. One recording, now buried deep within horror forums, captured soft whispers in the background. An audio analyst claimed the voices were repeating the same phrase over and over. Name me, name me, name me. The font remains untouched, wrapped in chains, a cracked wooden sign nailed across it. Do not disturb what is no name. Some say the voice returns every 7 years, each time louder, each time more coherent. Others claim they've seen a small handprint appear on the font's rim, though no child ever sets foot near it. But the strangest part? Every child baptized there, those who dared to use the cradle of the forsaken, was never quite the same. Some stopped speaking. Others developed an uncanny understanding of dead languages. And one, years later, carved the exact Latin phrase from the font into her bedroom wall. Infans emissus, said vigilance. The child is lost but watching, whether spirit, curse, or echo of forgotten rites. The whispers beneath the baptismal font are still said to linger in the silence, waiting for another name, another voice, another willing soul. She arrived at St. Verena's convent during the fall of 1978, at the cusp of a particularly long and bitter winter. The other nuns assumed she was a late vocation, quiet, austere, obedient. She didn't speak much. She took her vows in silence. And most notably, she never blinked. At first, it was dismissed as a quirk. Maybe she had some ocular condition. Maybe she was simply very disciplined. But the longer she stayed, the more the other sisters noticed something off. She would sit perfectly still during Vespers, her eyes fixed on the crucifix above the altar, never flinching, never fluttering. During meals, she stared ahead, unmoving while chewing. And at night, some swore they'd pass her cell and find her sitting upright in bed, eyes wide open in the darkness. Some of the sisters began avoiding her. Others tried to engage her with gentle conversation, but she'd only respond with a shallow nod or a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her stare, unbroken and unwavering, made even the Mother Superior uneasy. Strange things started to happen soon after she arrived. It began subtly, candles extinguishing all at once. Crucifixes turned upside down in the chapel, without anyone claiming responsibility. Choir books disappearing and later found with their pages rearranged or written over in a language no one could read. One sister, Sister Miriam, reported waking up in the middle of the night to see the blinking nun standing silently at the end of her bed. She hadn't heard the door open. She hadn't heard footsteps, just the slow, suffocating sense that she was being watched by something that didn't understand sleep. Miriam left the convent the next day. There were no accusations, just whispered speculations behind closed doors. The nuns called her Sorer, Silentium, Sister Silence, a name born out of reverence, or maybe fear. She was the subject of quiet prayers, the reason some began sleeping with rosaries clutched tighter than ever. Then one night, the bell rang on its own. The bell tower of St. Verena's had been broken for years. Its rope had snapped after a lightning strike in 1969, and it was never repaired. But on the first Sunday of Advent that year, the bell tolled at precisely 3 a.m., 13 times. The sisters gathered, frightened and confused, at the base of the tower. That's when they noticed that Sorer Silentium was missing. They searched every corridor, every room. Her cell was untouched, bed perfectly made. The only unusual detail was her Bible, left open on her desk, not to the Psalms or the Gospels, but to a passage that no one could place. The text didn't match any known translation. It wasn't Latin or Greek or Hebrew, but the handwriting, tight, controlled, in dark crimson ink, was unmistakably hers. What followed was even stranger. Over the next few weeks, The convent experienced an unexplainable cold, even when the heating systems were running. Shadows moved independently of their sources. The chapel's stained glass windows started forming condensation from the inside, weeping slow trails of moisture even on warm days. And then the dreams began. One by one, the sisters started dreaming of her. In the dreams, they were always in the chapel. She was standing at the altar, eyes wide, unblinking, arms extended as if to welcome them. But her face was not the same. It was longer, stretched unnaturally. Her veil fluttered despite the absence of wind. Her mouth never moved, but the sisters said they could hear her voice in their heads. Calm, low, commanding. Open your eyes. Each time they tried to wake, they found themselves paralyzed in bed, heart pounding, unable to move for minutes. Sleep became terrifying. The Mother Superior finally called in a visiting priest, a man known for discretion and rumored to have dealt with matters that didn't quite fit inside Scripture. He arrived quietly and stayed for 3 nights. On the second night, he asked to see the cell. On the third, he left without a word. He didn't stay for morning mass. After his departure, things quieted somewhat. The sisters stopped speaking of her entirely, as if her very memory might bring her back. But the convent never felt the same. Too many rooms that felt just a little too cold. Too many mirrors that seemed to fog at the edges when no one was near. Then, decades later, a renovation team found something. Behind the altar, hidden behind a false panel, was a narrow, windowless chamber. Inside, there was a small wooden stool and a crude drawing on the wall. Charcoal etched into the stone. A woman in a nun's habit, her eyes wide, staring directly outward. No pupils, no irises, just white, empty circles. And beneath the image, in that same deep crimson ink, for words. She never left. Watching. It started with silence. Father Raymond had been the confessor at St. Augustine's Church for over 20 years. He'd heard everything in that time. Sins whispered through tears, secrets laced with shame, but never silence. That Sunday, just after evening mass, he entered the confessional booth as he always did. The left side creaked open. He heard someone step in, sit down, but they said nothing. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," he prompted gently, but the other side remained quiet. Still, he could feel the presence, tangible, almost oppressive. He cleared his throat. "Whenever you're ready." And then, finally, a voice. Thin, whispered, sexless. I watched them burn. The words didn't hit him at first. He blinked, puzzled. "Excuse me." I watched them burn, the voice repeated. The church, the people, they deserved it. Father Raymond leaned closer. The air had grown thick inside the booth. His mouth was dry. "What church? What people?" he asked. Silence. He waited for a breath, a sigh. Anything. But the booth remained still. After a minute, he opened the curtain to check the other side. It was empty. He peered into the nave. It was dark, hollow. The pews empty. Not even the sacristan remained. Assuming it was some twisted prank, he locked the confessional and left for the night. But as the week progressed, the voice returned. Always after Mass. Always alone. I stood beneath the pulpit when the fire started. The voice whispered another evening. They screamed, but the stone muffled them. "Who are you?" Raymond asked. No reply. Each confession grew more vivid. The voice began to name names. Old names. Parishioners who hadn't stepped foot in the church in decades, some long dead. Marjorie knew what they did. She tried to stop it. That's why she was the first to burn. Father Raymond's hands trembled as he flipped through ancient church records. There she was, Marjorie Ainsley, choir mistress, died in a fire. 1963. The entry was brief. Clinical. No details about a cause. He contacted the diocese historian, but no fire had ever been officially recorded at St. Augustine's. No documentation, no news clippings, as if it never happened. But then he found it, in the basement archive, behind rotted hymnals and a water-damaged pulpit drape. A single photograph, black and white, charred stone, rubble, a collapsed roof line that unmistakably belonged to the original chapel. There had been a fire. The next evening, he sat in the confessional before Mass, heart hammering. He didn't wait long. "They never found my bones," the voice said. This time, the words were clearer, almost pleased. "I confessed, but they wouldn't forgive me. So I stayed, waiting. I want you to absolve me." "Who are you?" Raymond asked again. The voice chuckled, dry and low. "You've already invited me in." The booth shuddered. The walls trembled softly, as though someone behind them had pressed against the thin wood with full weight. "I can't absolve what I don't understand," Raymond stammered. "Tell me what you did." "You've seen it," the voice whispered. "The fire, the ashes, the unmarked graves." And he had the back courtyard where nothing grew, the one patch of earth always slightly warm, even in winter. The voice was waiting for something, craving release. "I was the bell ringer," it said finally. "They told me I couldn't join the priesthood. They laughed. Call me wrong." Raymond's stomach turned. "So I locked the doors, lit the curtains. I rang the bell while they begged." The following silence was suffocating. He felt the weight of it settle in his chest. "Why come now?" he asked. But the voice didn't answer. That night, Raymond didn't sleep. He dreamt of smoke, of a brass bell swinging violently in a collapsing tower. The walls around him groaned. He woke to find soot under his fingernails. He tried to tell someone. The bishop, the auxiliary priest. No one believed him. "Maybe you've been working too hard, Father," they said. "Confessional fatigue. It happens." But the voice persisted. "You've heard me. You've accepted the sin. Now you must carry it." One evening, Raymond entered the confessional and found the air icy, damp with rot. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," the voice said, echoing through both sides of the booth. "And now, it's your turn." The light in the confessional flickered. Raymond's breath fogged. He reached for the curtain, but couldn't move. His body was rigid, trapped. The door across from him creaked open, not with footsteps, but with something heavier. A pressure, like something old had stepped into the church after decades beneath stone. And then a second voice spoke. It sounded like his own. "Forgive me, Father." The curtain snapped shut. The sacristan found the confessional sealed the next morning, locked from the inside. No sign of Father Raymond. Only a single smudge on the confessional wall. Black ash in the shape of a handprint pressed outward. There's a small, nearly forgotten church tucked between the woods of a quiet Massachusetts town. It's not listed on maps. Most locals say they've passed it hundreds of times, but swear they've never seen it before. The foundation is stone, the roof slate. But what draws the eye is what lies within. An altar where a single candle has burned continuously for over 60 years. Or at least, that's what the surviving records claim. In 1961, Father Gregory Ellison was appointed to the church. He wasn't particularly well known, and some said his placement felt more like exile than promotion. But those who met him described a man deeply committed to his flock, though increasingly withdrawn in his final years. The church, called St. Aurelia's, had long suffered from dwindling attendance. But on the first Sunday after Gregory's arrival, something strange happened. A flame lit during Mass was still burning when the congregation returned the following Sunday. At first, it was dismissed. A prank, a faulty memory. Perhaps someone had simply relit it and forgot. But when it happened again the next week, and again the week after that, people began to talk. The candle, a thick white wax pillar set in a brass holder, had no scent, no markings, and reportedly never melted down. Father Gregory refused to address it directly, only saying, "Faith is not always for understanding. Sometimes it's for enduring." Over the years, those who tended the church noted something else. The room around the candle stayed warm, even in the dead of winter. Animals wouldn't enter the sanctuary, and photos of the altar, especially those taken at night, developed with odd streaks or blurred, smoky figures, even when no one else was present. In 1974, a visiting bishop attempted to extinguish the candle, calling it a distraction from doctrine. But despite using holy water, snuffers, and even smothering it with a cloth, the flame resisted. One witness claimed the cloth caught fire, though no burn marks were ever found. That same bishop was hospitalized 2 days later after collapsing in his quarters. He recovered, but refused to speak of the candle again. Then, in 1983, Father Gregory vanished. No designación, no final sermón, no trace. His car was left in the back lot, keys still in the ignition. Parishioners said he had seemed agitated that week, murmuring things during service that didn't match the liturgy. One witness claimed he had taken to staring at the candle during Mass, sometimes for minutes at a time, completely silent. When he disappeared, the candle continued burning. Here's where things get stranger. Over the next 2 decades, every new priest assigned to St. Aurelia's requested transfer within a year. Some cited health problems. Others claimed their dreams were being interrupted. One wrote, anonymously, that he heard whispering behind him during sermons, soft voices speaking in Latin. When he turned, the pews were empty. Church records show that funerals held at St. Aurelia's became rare, and when they did occur, strange patterns emerged. Multiple families reported crows gathering along the steeple before the services. One even claimed that the body of a loved one, buried the week before, was found reinterred at the base of the altar, coffin perfectly preserved, though no one had disturbed the graveyard. The Vatican never formally investigated, but in 2007, an unnamed archivist allegedly visited under the pretense of evaluating the building's structural integrity. He stayed for just 1 day and returned with a photograph. The image has since circulated online, though skeptics say it's doctored. In the photo, the candle is lit, but the flame appears inverted, curling downward instead of up, and beneath it, a faint silhouette can be seen reflected in the brass holder. A face, not Gregory's. By 2015, St. Aurelia's was decommissioned, officially due to lack of attendance and structural concerns. Unofficially, parishioners say something else. That final winter, before its closure, one woman reported seeing a man standing by the candle during a snowstorm. He wore outdated robes and had his hands clasped in prayer. But when she stepped inside, the figure vanished. The candle, still burning, cast no shadows. Some say the candle is a miracle. Others believe it's a curse, a tether to something ancient, bound in flame. The prevailing theory among local theologians, and yes, a few have taken interest, is that the flame may be a type of guardian, trapping something rather than protecting from it, which could explain the constant warmth, the aversion from animals, the disappearances. What unsettles many is not the flame itself, but what it suggests, that there may be relics, not of holiness, but of restraint, objects that keep darkness in, not out. One priest reportedly claimed before resigning that the candle hungers, and that every hour it burns, something gets closer to waking. Since the church's closure, the grounds have become overgrown. The doors are chained shut, but on certain nights, those passing by say they can still see it through the high arched windows. A soft orange flicker, never wavering, never dimming. A flame that never dies. A candle that never burns out. And a church that waits for something. They say music can reach places words cannot. It can heal, inspire, and even summon emotions buried deep inside the soul. But sometimes music can do the opposite. It can haunt, it can twist, and sometimes it can disappear altogether, leaving only a chilling silence behind. This is the story of a church choir, one unlike any other, a choir with no voices. The church stood on the outskirts of a quiet town, a structure of stained glass windows and ancient stone that looked like it had been carved out of time itself. Every Sunday, the small congregation would gather, led by the warm, rich sound of the choir. Their voices lifted the hymns to the rafters, weaving a comforting spell over the congregation. It was a place where the townsfolk found hope and solace. That was before the choir vanished. It began one autumn when a new choir director arrived, an enigmatic man named Father Morrow. No one knew much about him except that he came from a distant city and that he spoke little of his past. He had a cold, almost unnatural stillness about him, and his eyes held a strange, distant gleam. At first, the choir rehearsals were ordinary, but soon something changed. The choir members started complaining about their voices. Not that they were losing them, but that when they sang, the sound seemed hollow, as if the music was swallowed by the air itself. On some days, they could sing perfectly, their voices clear and bright. On others, no matter how hard they tried, no sound came out. It wasn't just a loss of volume. It was an absence of sound, a ghostly muteness that left the singers unable to produce even a whisper. Panic spread among the choir. The congregation noticed, too. Services grew eerie, with silent lips mouthing hymns while the church filled with an oppressive, unnatural quiet. Father Morrow insisted it was a test of faith. Silence is a prayer, he told the choir. Sometimes the truest worship is found in stillness. But the choir knew better. Something was wrong. Something invisible was stealing their voices. One evening, during a rehearsal, the choir gathered in the dimly lit loft. As they began to sing, the room grew colder. Their breath became visible, puffing out in misty clouds. The first notes faltered, then vanished completely. Then they heard it, a sound unlike any human voice, a deep, resonant humming that seemed to come from the very walls of the church. It was neither melody nor noise, but something in between, an ancient, otherworldly vibration. The choir members froze. Their mouths moved, but no sound followed. The humming grew louder, filling the space where their voices should have been. Father Morrow stood at the edge of the loft, his eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. When the humming reached a crescendo, he opened his eyes, which now glowed faintly with an unnatural light. "Sing with me," he commanded, voice low and hypnotic. Terrified but compelled, the choir began to move their lips again, this time trying to match the eerie hum. And then, slowly, their voices returned, not their own, but something else's. A chorus of hollow, unearthly tones that chilled the marrow. The next day, the choir vanished. No one saw them leave. The loft was empty, save for the ancient hymn books resting open, pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze that wasn't there. The congregation searched everywhere, homes, nearby forests, even the crypt beneath the church, but found no sign of the choir. In their place, the church choir's sound continued to fill the sanctuary every Sunday, but it was no longer human. The haunting, hollow humming poured from the empty loft, a choir with no voices, singing hymns of sorrow and silence. Some say the choir was claimed by something ancient, something that lives between sound and silence, feeding on voices to preserve its own eerie song. Others whisper that Father Morrow was a gatekeeper, sacrificing his choir to a dark hymn no living voice could bear to sing. But the most unsettling part is this. On quiet nights, if you stand outside the church, you can still hear them, the choir with no voices, singing from within a melody that no living soul can ever join. In a small town nestled between rolling hills, stood a centuries-old church with a bell tower that scraped the sky like a dark finger. The bell had not rung in decades, yet the townsfolk spoke of it with hushed reverence and something else, unease. The church was the heart of the village, but the bell tower was its secret. Jacob, a young man from the town, had always been fascinated by the church. He had grown up hearing stories about the bell tower from his grandmother, who warned him never to climb it. "There's something in there," she would say, "a shadow that watches but never speaks." As a skeptic, Jacob dismissed it as an old superstition, but his curiosity only grew. One autumn evening, Jacob volunteered to fix the church's broken clock. The old caretaker, a gaunt man with eyes like cold stones, reluctantly handed him the key to the bell tower door. "Stay only as long as you must," he warned. "And whatever you do, don't look up." Jacob nodded, but his mind was already racing with questions. Why didn't the bell ring anymore? What was this shadow his grandmother spoke of? As he ascended the winding staircase of creaking wood, the air grew colder, heavier. The light from his lantern flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the stone walls. When he reached the top, the bell tower's door groaned open to reveal the giant bronze bell, coated in dust and cobwebs. It was silent, but the silence felt alive, thick and waiting. As Jacob examined the mechanism, he noticed something strange. The bell rope was frayed, but not from where. It looked scratched, like claws had shredded it. A sudden chill prickled his skin, and he heard it, a faint tapping, rhythmic, like a heartbeat, coming from the shadowed corner of the tower. Jacob's breath caught. He told himself it was just the wind, or perhaps a loose stone. But the tapping grew louder, more deliberate. Slowly, his gaze drifted upward. There, on the wall opposite the bell, was a shape, a shadow that did not belong to anything visible. It was tall and stretched, like a figure hunched over, watching him with unseen eyes. The shadow moved ever so slightly, though no one else was there. Jacob froze. His heart thundered as the temperature dropped further. The shadow seemed to pulse with life, its edges flickering like smoke in a dying fire. In that moment, Jacob realized the stories were true. This was no ordinary shadow. His lantern flickered wildly, then dimmed. In the gloom, the shadow began to shift, elongating fingers creeping toward him, inch by inch, as if reaching for something. Desperately, Jacob grabbed the bell rope and gave it a firm pull. The bell clanged, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the valley, shaking the very bones of the church. The shadow recoiled instantly, retreating into the dark corners like smoke being sucked back into a flame. Jacob didn't wait to see what would happen next. He fled down the staircase, the tapping now replaced by a low, guttural growl behind him. When he burst through the bell tower door into the crisp night air, the sound stopped abruptly. The caretaker was waiting below, his face unreadable. "You rang the bell," he said simply. "It's been silent for a reason." Jacob never returned to the tower after that night, but the townsfolk noticed something strange. The bell continued to toll at midnight on its own, a slow, mournful sound that echoed through the valley. No one dared climb the tower anymore, and sometimes, just before the bell tolled, people swore they could see a dark figure standing at the top, a shadow watching, waiting. In a small, quiet town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, there was a church that had stood for over a century. It was the kind of place where generations gathered every Sunday, seeking comfort and guidance under the worn wooden beams and stained glass windows. The church's new pastor, Reverend Elias Moore, was a man of humble demeanor and a deep, unsettling intensity that some parishioners found hard to ignore. Reverend Moore had taken over the church only a few months earlier, after the sudden and mysterious departure of his predecessor. The townsfolk whispered about how the old pastor had left abruptly, but no one dared to ask too many questions. There was a heavy silence that seemed to hang over the church, as if something unseen had settled into the pews, the pulpit, and the ancient stone walls. One Sunday morning, the congregation gathered for service under a low, gray sky that promised rain. The air was thick with anticipation, though no one knew why. Reverend Moore stepped onto the pulpit with his usual solemn expression, clutching a worn leather-bound Bible that seemed to have traveled through time with him. He began the sermon not with the comforting words the parishioners expected, but with a story, a parable about fate, choice, and the thin veil between life and death. His voice was calm, but heavy, almost hypnotic. "There is a path laid before each of us," he intoned, "a road that winds through shadows and light. Sometimes that path is clear, marked by faith and hope. But other times it twists into darkness, where the steps we take lead us toward a fate we cannot escape." The congregation listened, rapt but uneasy. There was something about the way Reverend Moore spoke that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. He described a figure, an unseen watcher, a presence that lingered just beyond the edges of vision, waiting patiently for the moment to claim its due. As the sermon unfolded, Reverend Moore's words became more specific, almost too specific. He spoke of a loss that would come to the church before the next full moon, a death that would shake the community to its core. He did not say who, only that the shadow would fall on one of them, that their path would end too soon. The silence after the sermon was thick, suffocating. No one dared to speak, as if voicing the prediction would make it come true. Over the next days, a strange unease settled over the town. People whispered in hushed tones about the pastor's sermon, some dismissing it as dark theatrics, others unable to shake the chill it left behind. The local news even picked up on the story, and the church became a place both feared and watched. Among the parishioners was a man named Thomas, a quiet and reserved man who attended service every week but rarely spoke to others. He had been struggling with illness, though he kept it private. When the sermon was delivered, Thomas found himself unable to shake the feeling that the death Reverend Moore spoke of was somehow tied to him. One evening, Thomas visited the church after hours, drawn by a compulsion he didn't understand. The sanctuary was empty and bathed in the pale glow of moonlight filtering through the stained glass. As he stood by the altar, a sudden chill swept through the room, and he felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him. In the silence, a soft whisper seemed to echo from the pulpit. It was a voice not his own, urging him to choose, to accept what was coming, or to fight against the path fate had set. The whispers grew louder, filling the vast space with a dissonant chorus that only Thomas could hear. Days passed, and the town held its breath. Thomas grew weaker, his face pale and haunted. The church remained a place of uneasy refuge, its pews filled with those who came seeking answers or perhaps a way to defy the darkness Reverend Moore had foretold. On the night before the full moon, the church bells tolled unexpectedly, their mournful sound ringing out across the town. Inside, Reverend Moore stood alone in the pulpit, his eyes reflecting a knowing sadness. He whispered a final prayer, one that seemed both a blessing and a farewell. The next morning, the town awoke to the news. Thomas had passed away peacefully in his sleep. No one could explain the suddenness. But those who remembered the sermon understood the grim fulfillment of Reverend Moore's prophecy. What was most unsettling, however, was what was found in Thomas's hand, a folded piece of paper with a single line written in shaky handwriting. The path is set, but not all shadows are what they seem. The church still stands, its walls holding the echoes of that fateful sermon. And Reverend Moore? No one knows where he went after Thomas's death, but some say he walks the night, searching for the next soul whose path will cross with the shadows waiting just beyond the light. The church had always been a place of quiet solace for the small town of Millbridge. Built over a century ago, its stained glass windows cast fractured rainbows across the worn wooden pews every Sunday morning. But in recent months, something had shifted in the air, a coldness, an unsettling stillness that no one could explain. It began with the sound, faint at first, like a whisper caught on the wind. Then, unmistakably, footsteps, soft, deliberate footsteps echoing behind the altar after the last parishioner had left. James, the new caretaker, was the first to notice. A practical man in his early 30s, he dismissed the tales of ghosts and spirits as superstition. The church was old, creaky, no more than that. But the footsteps grew louder, more persistent. Always behind the altar, always when no one else was around. One rainy evening, James stayed late to clean the sanctuary. The storm outside rattled the windows, lightning briefly illuminating the dark wooden beams overhead. He wiped the pews methodically, humming an old hymn to himself, when the unmistakable sound began again. Step, step, step. It was slow, rhythmic. Moving closer, James froze, heart pounding. He strained his eyes toward the altar, shrouded in shadows. No one was there, yet the footsteps continued, moving side to side, circling the altar as if someone was pacing, waiting. Gathering courage, James stepped toward the altar steps. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but dust and empty candlesticks. He called out softly, "Hello? Is someone there?" Only silence. That night, James barely slept. The footsteps haunted his thoughts. He wondered if the church was more than just wood and stone, if it held secrets beneath its sacred surface. He remembered the old parish records tucked away in the back office. Maybe the past could explain the present. The next morning, James pored over the dusty ledgers. The church had weathered more than a century of history. Weddings, funerals, baptisms. But one name caught his eye, repeated again and again in the margins: Father Alden. Father Alden had served the church in the late 1800s, a man known for his stern sermons and strict discipline. Yet, the records hinted at something darker, whispers of a scandal buried deep in the archives. Parishioners who had suddenly left town, unexplained illnesses, and a series of mysterious disappearances near the church grounds. James felt a chill. Could the footsteps be tied to Father Alden, to the restless souls of the past? That evening, he returned to the church, determined to explore the crypt beneath the altar. The heavy stone floor hid a trapdoor, coated in dust and nearly invisible. With effort, he pried it open and descended into the cold, narrow space below. The air was thick and musty, filled with the scent of damp earth and forgotten memories. Flickering his flashlight, James moved cautiously along the stone walls. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint drip of water somewhere in the darkness. As he reached the far end, a sudden sound made him stop. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, behind him. He spun around, flashlight beam darting wildly, but no one was there. The footsteps came again, closer now, circling him like a predator stalking its prey. James's breath quickened. He backed away toward the stairs, but the air grew colder, heavier, as if the shadows themselves were pressing in. Then, from the darkness, a whisper, a voice barely audible, yet unmistakably human. "Why do you disturb the rest?" Frozen, James stared into the blackness, searching for the source. The voice was laced with sorrow and anger, a bitter echo of a time long gone. "I only want to understand," James whispered back, voice trembling. The footsteps ceased. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the distant tolling of the church bell. When James finally emerged from the crypt, the first light of dawn was filtering through the stained glass. He knew the church held more secrets than anyone had guessed, secrets that walked just behind the altar, waiting for those brave enough to listen. The church had stood for centuries, its stone walls worn by time and weather, but still unyielding, a steadfast monument to faith and devotion. Most days, it was a place of quiet prayers and soft hymns, a refuge for the community. But the basement chapel was different. It was small, rarely used, and almost forgotten, except for one locked door at the far end, one that no one was supposed to open. Father Michael had been the newest priest assigned to the parish, eager and devout. When he first arrived, the older parishioners had given him cryptic warnings. "Stay away from the basement chapel," they said, their voices dropping to whispers. Some doors should never be opened. Curiosity gnawed at him, but duty kept him focused on his sermons, his confessions, and the many responsibilities of the church. Still, the locked door haunted his thoughts. It was heavy, old iron with rusted hinges, and a lock so ancient it looked like it belonged to another century. One evening, after everyone had left and the last candle flickered out, Father Michael found himself drawn downstairs. The air grew colder as he stepped into the basement chapel. The faint scent of incense lingered, though no service had been held for weeks. He approached the door, running his fingers over the cold iron. Something about it felt alive, as if it pulsed with a heartbeat just beyond the wood. Suddenly, a low whisper seemed to ripple from behind it, a voice too soft to understand, yet filled with urgent sorrow. Heart pounding, he tried the lock. It was stuck fast, but then, to his surprise, it clicked open easily, as if inviting him in. Inside, the room was pitch black. He lit a candle, and the flame revealed peeling walls covered in faded religious symbols, some familiar, others disturbingly unfamiliar. At the center was an altar, worn and cracked, with a single book resting on it. As Father Michael approached, the candlelight flickered wildly, and the shadows around him seemed to deepen, stretching and twisting unnaturally. He reached for the book, its leather cover cold and rough under his fingertips. Opening it, he found pages filled with prayers written in a language he did not recognize, words that seemed to crawl and shift as his eyes moved across them. A sudden draft extinguished his candle, plunging him into darkness. In the silence, he heard the whisper again, clearer this time, pleading desperate, as if trapped souls sought release. Fumbling, he relit the candle, and the room looked different. The walls bore fresh scratches, as though something had clawed at them. The altar was smeared with something dark, but the flickering flame refused to reveal exactly what. A cold breath brushed his neck, and Father Michael spun around, but no one was there. Only the heavy silence, broken by the distant tolling of the church bell. He stumbled back toward the door, but found it slammed shut. No matter how hard he pushed or pulled, it wouldn't budge. Panic rose within him, but his training urged calm. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, cloaked, faceless, and whispering the same incomprehensible prayers. The voice was both a lullaby and a warning. Father Michael realized this was no ordinary chapel. It was a prison, a place where something ancient had been locked away, and now it wanted out. As the figure reached toward him, the candlelight went out once more. In the suffocating darkness, Father Michael's last thought was the warning whispered by the parishioners. Some doors should never be opened. In the heart of a small, forgotten town stood a church that had been there for centuries. Weathered stone walls, stained glass windows cracked from time, and an aura of solemnity that clung to it like a shadow. This church was no ordinary place of worship. It was home to a secret whispered among the oldest residents, a secret about a priest who never aged. The story begins with Father Gabriel, a man who arrived in the town in the late 1800s. He was unlike any other priest the parish had ever seen, calm, mysterious, and unervingly young-looking. From the moment he stepped through the heavy wooden doors, the townspeople noticed something strange. Though decades passed, Father Gabriel's appearance never changed. Year after year, he looked exactly the same. The same sharp features, the same piercing eyes, the same subtle smile that never quite reached his eyes. At first, the villagers admired him. His sermons were mesmerizing, his presence comforting, and his kindness sincere. But over time, unease grew. How could one man defy time itself? Questions were quietly asked, but Father Gabriel never spoke of his past or origins. He simply said, "Faith transcends time," and left it at that. One evening, a young seminarian named Thomas arrived to assist Father Gabriel. Thomas was eager and curious, but soon he too noticed the strange whispers among the townsfolk. They spoke of the priest's nightly rituals that were said to take place deep within the church's crypt, a place none dared to enter after sunset. Driven by a mix of skepticism and intrigue, Thomas decided to uncover the truth. One cold night, under the cover of darkness, he slipped into the crypt. The air was thick with the scent of old stone and damp earth. In the faint glow of his lantern, he saw a narrow staircase spiraling downward. His heart pounded as he descended. At the bottom, the crypt opened into a small chamber lined with ancient symbols carved into the walls. In the center stood Father Gabriel, eyes closed, chanting in a language Thomas didn't understand. Around him, candles flickered, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. The priest's voice was low, hypnotic, and unyielding. Suddenly, Father Gabriel opened his eyes. They seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Thomas froze, caught between fear and fascination. The priest's gaze pierced through him, and a cold chill ran down his spine. Without breaking his chant, Father Gabriel gestured toward a stone altar where a worn leather-bound book lay open. Thomas stepped closer, compelled by an unseen force. The pages were filled with arcane symbols and cryptic incantations. It was a book of ancient rituals that promised eternal youth and protection from death, but at a terrible cost. Thomas realized the truth. Father Gabriel was not just a man of God. He was a guardian of a dark secret. The priest had made a pact long ago, binding his soul to the church itself. His eternal youth was a curse as much as it was a blessing, sustained by the crypt's ancient magic. Terrified, Thomas fled the crypt, but he could not escape the feeling that Father Gabriel was always watching, always waiting. Over the following weeks, Thomas noticed strange changes in the priest. His presence became more ominous, his sermons filled with subtle warnings. The townspeople, too, grew wary, some even whispering that the church was cursed. One night, Thomas confronted Father Gabriel, demanding to know the truth. The priest's response was chilling. "Faith requires sacrifice," he said softly. "To protect this sacred place, I gave up my mortality. But the price is loneliness, watching generations come and go while I remain. Thomas was left with a choice: to join the eternal vigil or to leave forever, knowing some secrets were better left buried. The legend of the priest who didn't age continues to haunt that small town. Parishioners report hearing faint chanting beneath the church at night and seeing a figure at the bell tower, unchanged by time. And though Father Gabriel's face remains youthful, his eyes tell a story of centuries lost, a guardian bound by faith and darkness. What does it mean to defy time? Is eternal life a blessing or a curse? And how far would one go to protect a sacred place? In a small, forgotten village stood an ancient church, its walls heavy with centuries of silent prayers and secrets. This church was known for a single remarkable feature: a large oil painting that hung behind the altar. The painting depicted a serene biblical scene, a group of saints gathered around a radiant light, their faces peaceful and kind. The villagers believed it was a blessing, a symbol of divine protection watching over their humble home. The painting had hung there for decades, untouched and unquestioned. Parishioners found comfort in its presence during sermons, and visitors often paused to admire its craftsmanship. The artist was unknown, though the style suggested it was from the late 18th century. Nobody cared to learn more, for it seemed a sacred relic, frozen in time. Then, one cold autumn morning, everything changed. The priest assigned to the church, Father Martin, arrived early for his usual morning prayers. As he walked through the dimly lit nave, his eyes instinctively went to the painting. What he saw made his breath catch. The faces in the painting were different, not simply weathered or faded. No, something far more disturbing. Where once there had been calm expressions, there were now grimaces of agony and despair. The radiant light at the center of the scene had dimmed to a dull, flickering glow, casting strange shadows across the figures. The saints' eyes no longer looked peaceful. They seemed hollow, as if staring beyond the wall at something unseen. Father Martin blinked, sure that the fading morning light had played tricks on him. He stepped closer, reaching out a trembling hand to touch the frame. The cold wood was the same, but the image itself was unmistakably altered. Word quickly spread through the village. The painting had changed overnight, whispered the townsfolk. Some refused to enter the church, fearing a curse. Others claimed to hear soft cries when standing near the altar late at night. Still, the painting drew a strange fascination, a lure for those who sought to understand its dark transformation. Father Martin, though shaken, was determined to uncover the truth. He contacted an art historian who specialized in religious iconography and restorations. The expert arrived, a middle-aged woman named Clara, who examined the painting with a careful, professional eye. Her analysis was baffling. There was no evidence of tampering or repainting. The canvas and pigments were consistent with the original period. No modern additions, no hidden mechanisms. The painting had changed naturally. But how? Clara proposed a chilling theory. The painting was a living artifact, somehow responding to unseen spiritual forces within the church. She referenced historical accounts of shifting icons, rare cases where sacred images appeared to morph as reflections of the surrounding spiritual energy, often during times of unrest or evil presence. The villagers had experienced little turmoil, so this idea seemed far-fetched, until Father Martin shared strange incidents he'd noticed before the painting changed. For months prior, there were unexplained cold spots near the altar, a heavy feeling of dread during evening prayers, and occasional flickers in the church's candlelight. Parishioners spoke of seeing shadowy figures moving just out of the corner of their eyes, and some even reported hearing faint chanting in a language no one understood. Could the church itself be a battleground for forces beyond human understanding? Was the painting a silent witness, its image shifting to reveal the hidden darkness lurking within those sacred walls? One night, unable to resist, Father Martin returned alone to the church. The moon hung low, casting pale light through stained glass windows. He knelt before the altar and stared up at the painting. At first, the grim faces stared back as before, but then the figures seemed to move subtly, their mouths opening in silent screams, their eyes blinking. The light that once illuminated the scene flickered and went out completely, plunging the room into near darkness. Then, from the shadows behind the altar, a low whisper echoed. A prayer or a curse? Father Martin couldn't tell. He felt a cold breath on his neck, but when he turned, no one was there. Terrified yet unable to look away, he focused again on the painting. The faces were now distorted beyond recognition, twisted in torment, mouths stretched wide as if begging for release. One figure at the edge seemed to reach out of the canvas, a hand breaking the boundary between art and reality. Father Martin stumbled back, crashing into a pew. The church door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping him inside. The whispers grew louder, layered in voices from different eras, all mourning, pleading warning. When the villagers found Father Martin the next morning, he was seated on the floor, pale and speechless, eyes fixed on the painting that had returned to its original serene form. He never spoke of what happened that night, but after his experience, he left the parish and never returned. In the years that followed, the church became deserted, a hollow shell abandoned to time and shadow. The painting remains in place, hanging behind the altar, an enigma waiting for the next visitor brave enough to look. Some say the painting holds the trapped souls of those who sought sanctuary but found only torment. Others believe it reflects the church's own spiritual decay, a warning that even the holiest places can harbor darkness. And sometimes, when the moon is just right, villagers swear they see the figures in the painting shift again, their faces contorted in silent screams, as if pleading for release or revenge. The painting changed overnight, but what changed within the church, or within ourselves, might be far more terrifying. At first glance, the story of the painting seems a straightforward ghost tale, but beneath the surface lies a layered exploration of faith, perception, and the fragile boundary between sanctuary and prison. The church, traditionally a place of light and hope, becomes a stage for unsettling transformation. The painting's change is symbolic. It reveals how spiritual places can harbor unseen darkness, perhaps born from human suffering, guilt, or forgotten sins. The shifting faces reflect the duality of holiness and horror, saints turned anguished victims, the light dimming to shadows. This transformation invites us to question the nature of faith itself. Are we blinded by the facade of sanctity? Does the church's authority hide secrets too terrible to confront? The whispered chanting and shadowy figures suggest a haunting not merely of spirits, but of history, layers of unresolved trauma and spiritual corruption echoing through time. The fact that the painting changes naturally, without physical interference, hints at forces beyond human control or understanding, challenging the viewer's grasp on reality. Father Martin's experience is a classic descent into psychological horror, his growing dread, the unseen whispers, the painting that becomes a gateway to something otherworldly. His silence afterward suggests that some truths are too horrifying to articulate, a common theme in cosmic and existential horror. The hand breaking through the canvas symbolizes the breach between worlds, the fragile boundary between the spiritual and physical realms. It also serves as a metaphor for trapped souls or evil influences reaching out, seeking escape or dominance. Finally, the story leaves us with an unresolved tension. The church stands abandoned, but the painting remains, waiting, watching. It implies that some places, some memories, and some horrors cannot be erased, only endured or confronted. In essence, the painting that changed overnight is a haunting meditation on how history, faith, and unseen forces intertwine, reminding us that darkness can lurk in the most sacred places, and sometimes it's the eyes that watch us back that reveal the deepest horrors. In the heart of a sleepy town stood an old church, weathered by time and shadowed by tall oaks that whispered secrets with every gust of wind. The church was known simply as St. Elsinore's, a name that carried with it a quiet reverence and an unspoken wariness among the locals. What made St. Elsinore's different wasn't its age, nor the intricate stained glass windows that caught the dying sun's light with a haunting beauty. It was the final service held there, a Sunday like any other, that became the stuff of unsettling legend. The church had been closing for months, its congregation dwindling, the priest elderly and frail. His name was Father Bernard, a man whose gentle demeanor belied the sharp mind and deep faith he carried. But in his last days, there was something unusual about him. Parishioners whispered that he seemed distracted, often pausing mid-sermon as if hearing a voice no one else could. On the final Sunday, the church was packed. An unusually large crowd gathered to bid farewell. The air was thick with nostalgia and sorrow, candles flickering softly against the stained glass that painted the pews with crimson and sapphire. Father Bernard stood at the pulpit, his hands trembling slightly as he delivered what would be his final sermon. His voice was steady, but carried an undercurrent of something strange, a resonance, almost as if the church itself was breathing with him. He spoke of faith, forgiveness, and the unseen battles between light and darkness. His words wove a tapestry of hope, yet beneath them, a cold thread of something else lingered, something almost too heavy to grasp. As the sermon drew to a close, Father Bernard paused, his eyes closing briefly. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "And so, we say the final Amen." The congregation responded in unison, their voices echoing through the vaulted ceiling. Amen. But what happened next was unlike anything they expected. Instead of the expected silence, the word Amen was returned to them, echoed back, but not by the walls or the acoustics of the church. It was a voice, the same words spoken in a low, distorted tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The people froze. Eyes darted around nervously. The echoes didn't fade. They grew stronger, layering over each other like a chorus from beyond. Father Bernard opened his eyes, but something had changed. His face, once calm and serene, now carried a shadow, an expression caught between fear and awe. "Do you hear it?" he asked softly, almost afraid the others wouldn't. But the echo was relentless. Amen. 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 It was as if the church itself was speaking back, but with a voice twisted and broken, a warped reflection of their own faith. The congregation began to murmur, uneasy whispers rising like a rising tide. Some clasped their hands tighter, others glanced nervously toward the altar. Then, from the back of the church, a cold breeze swept through, extinguishing many of the candles in a sudden, unnatural gust. Darkness spilled in, thick and heavy. A faint, almost imperceptible movement was seen in the corner of the sanctuary, a flicker of shadow that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Father Bernard stepped down from the pulpit, his steps slow but purposeful, moving toward the altar as if drawn by an unseen force. His fingers brushed the carved wood, tracing the edges of the crucifix with a trembling touch. Suddenly, the echoing amen ceased, replaced by a chilling silence, so profound it pressed down on the hearts of those gathered. Then came a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable, "Not yet.